Good morning, everyone. I'm Bryan Hanson. I am the agronomist at the Langdon Research Extension Center, and it's good to be back with you here again this year. So for the next half hour or so, I'll be talking to you about variety selection for hard red spring wheat, durum, and barley for 2022. So I'd kind of like to go over how the acreages have changed over the past year. And this year you can see soybean acreage is up quite significantly, a little over 7.2 million acres. Spring wheat was up slightly. Corn took quite an increase this year from 2 million acres to about 3.7 million. And then there are other small grains. Durum was about the same as it was in 2019. And the hard red winter wheat, it's pretty flat since 2017 as far as acreage is concerned. Well, of course, it was very interesting this year with the dry conditions we had. In the top slide here, we see the average air temperatures we had from the 1st of June till the end of July. Of course, this is the most critical time for wheat to develop and grow. And as you can see, during that time period, we had in the northeast part of the state, we had temperatures anywhere from 3 to 6 degrees above average, which is not very conducive to small grain development. And the percentage rain that we had in that time as well was also very low. Where from a little over 50% up to a few scattered areas, we got 76% in normal. This was from May 1st to July 31st. You can also see it was very scattered and within these areas as well, depending on your farm or even parts of your farm, whether the rain cloud came over would depend on a lot how your outcome of your wheat and other small grain trials would be this year. Well, later on in the growing season, in August in particular, now this is after the time period when most of the small grains had developed, their yield had already been established. And that's when we started getting some rain again. And you can see in the northeast part of the state here again, or on a statewide basis, it was quite variable. At Langdon, we had 136% of normal, and it was actually the 8th wettest on record for the Langdon station. And a lot of that was because we had a cloud come over and we had a 3-inch dump, as you would say, the first part of August. So a lot of farmers got a lot of their crop off before mid-August, and about that time we also had a period of rain for about 10 days. If you harvested that after that point, you might have seen some falling number problems. You might have seen some shattering issues from delayed harvest. So even though we had a very dry summer, it was complicated somewhat in August by some of the rainfall we had. Every year I like to kind of go over what varieties was raised in the state, and especially start out here in the northeast part of North Dakota. You can see our top varieties this year again were Faller and Westbred 9590, and then we went on to Volda, Murdoch, Cropland 3530, Igmar, Westbred 9497, and Prosper, and lesser amounts of Trigger 9719 and McLeod. On a statewide basis, you can see Igmar was our highest variety with the most acreage, followed by Volda and 9590. So I was going to talk a little bit about the releases for 2021, the newer ones. From Syngenta AgriPro, we had Gunsmoke, then AP Smith. Of course, AP Gunsmoke is a clear field line, so you can spray beyond on it. Mostly intended for the western North Dakota. But yields of some of these, their two clear field lines have looked very good in the northeast part of the state at times. A newer one is AP Smith, which is more of a kind of a above average yield and above average protein line. And then we have a couple new varieties from a group called Champions Alliance Group. and these two are Justify and Reckless. And from the data, you'll see some of these are more of a higher yielding line. And then Cropland, we had 3 new lines: CP 3099A, 3119A, and 3188. A stands for onless. So there's some new genetics in here. These plants are quite leafy. They're probably on the later side of maturity, and they don't have any awns. And some of them did quite well. The newer one from Meridian Seed is MS Cobra. And then Peterson Farm Seeds released their first variety called Buns, and this variety was one of the top yielders in the eastern part of the state trials. And I'd like to go briefly over some of the varieties that we tested and we'll be talking about, so you know what their source and what company they're from. A little disclaimer here: some of the pictures here are from last year. Our variety drill ships this year didn't look as great, so I kind of used last year's as well. So some of the pictures you see here and the labels, we don't have some of the newer varieties that we listed, and a few of the older ones have been dropped. So from NDSU, Andy Furlberg is the newest line. It's a little bit taller line, kind of average, above average yield and above average protein. Faller Blue was released in 2007. It's been very consistent yielder in the northeast part of the state, and as we saw from acreage, has still retained very large acreage in our part of the country. Minnesota line is the newest line. Torgy, I think, was released last year, and it's been getting some more acreage. Bowles is the oldest one we're testing. It's a very high protein line, lower yielding. And then we had Lang and MN Washburn. Syngenta AgriPro has a lot of varieties in the state, and they have top acreage varieties in the state in Igmar and Valda. The ones they have are McLeod. Longmire is a solid, semi-solid stem variety for areas with sawfly problems. The other Clearfield line they have is SY611. Murdoch was shown some acreage this year, and the newer ones, as we mentioned, were AP Smith and Gunsmoke. Just have one line from South Dakota called Driver, and Montana, which lines these are in state trials, so they're going all across the state, but really are not intended for our corner of the state. But the ones we had in this year were Lanning and Dagmar. Lima grain varieties included Cannon. Trigger has some acreage. It's a high yielding variety and later maturing. Rebel is probably above average yield and protein, so kind of a balanced variety. And Buster is also another higher yielding line. Lines we tested from Cropland were 3530. Again, is a little bit taller and above average yield and protein. We have 3915, and the newer onless types we talked about, and also the 3188. Westbred lines tested this year in state trials were 9479 and 9590. Previous years, Westbred wouldn't allow us to test any of their lines in our state trial, but these two lines had over 3% acreage across the state, so they were tested this year, not in any off-station sites, but just on the research centers. And Meridian, their newest line was mentioned was Cobra. They also had Ranchero and Barracuda. Lincoln wasn't in any of the state trials, but they were in some of the locations entered locally, and this is CHS varieties, 822, 8175, and 8432. Then you also had 21st Century Genetics. The newest one there is Wildcat. Dynagrow has lines Ambush, which did come up in some acreage, higher acreage reported this year in the northeast part of the state. Commander, we have Ballistic, and Velocity. Well, this year, of course, we didn't have a lot of rainfall, so we didn't have a lot of disease pressure as well. But it's always good to keep in mind you never know what next year's going to bring in store for us, so it's important to keep track of the scab reactions in these varieties. So here I have listed the varieties and the lowest scores, which are the 3 and the 4s, and the highest, the 7s, and all the other varieties were 5s and 6s. There's ones that show the most susceptibility at this time are Longmire, Soren, and Dagmar. And a lot of the newer lines that we're looking at, the Ballistic, other ones like the Trigger and Torgy, Gunsmoke, Justify, the 3119A Smith, Reckless, and the other newer cropland lines. A lot of these lines have a little better tolerance to scab than some of the other varieties. Always important to remember they're not totally scab tolerant. Usually, if you just spray a fungicide on a variety, you get a 60% reduction. So it's still important to choose a variety that has probably a lower scab tolerance. Bacterial leaf streak, again, was not a real important issue this year. You need rain splash to get the bacteria on the leaves and cause the symptoms as we see in the lower right hand corner. We didn't have a lot of rain splash this year. Maybe you were under a particular area, we got a hard rain or something. You may have seen some of this, but it wasn't widespread like we've seen in other years. And generally the lowest ratings, 3 and 4, the better varieties that we have are Lang, Torgy, and Trigger. And 4, some of the newer ones we're looking at would be the Smith, and also the Bun varieties are some of the newer lines that have a better rating. 5 and 6s would be average, and some of the ones where we have a little more susceptibility, you can see in the 7s and 8s, Cannon, Barracuda, Heartland, and Wildcat, and the 8s would be Gunsmoke and the West Bed lines. I'd like to show this relationship between yield and bacterial leaf score. This is from Grand Forks in 2019. So we just talked about the ratings anywhere from basically 1 to 9, and there's a pretty strong correlation. When you get up in 7, 8, 9, you can really get some yield reductions if these varieties have that number, where if you're anywhere from 2 to about 5, you don't see too much yield reduction. Between 5 and 6, it starts dropping off, and then again drops off more significantly when you get to 7, 8, and 9. So this graph shows the average spring wheat yield across the trials across the state. As mentioned before, rains were spotty this year, and it also obviously was in farmers' fields, and this also occurred in the variety trials across the state. The eastern part of the state and trials we had in Castleton, Prosper, and Grand Forks, of course, they had lower yields and rainfall, or lower precipitation and rainfall earlier on, but they were probably an area that had a little more subsoil and maybe got some scattered or timely rains. So we had very good yields in these trials, 80 bushels plus. Harrington and Henninger had yields above 40 bushels per acre. And there are several locations that had lower yields of below 20, Dickinson, Williston, and Minot. And here at Langdon, we only had average 24 bushels an acre. So of all the years I've been here, this is probably a trial where I've had the lowest average yield. A lot of that was due to, obviously, the drought. Hardly any subsoil moisture. When we started the year out, we had uneven emergence. And then, other issues showed up. We did have some shattering, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, another slide. So just to keep that in mind. And our other locations, Park River, Cavalier, Pekin, and Candu, have better yields, although we had some shattering issues in Pekin as well, which I'll talk about in a slide or two here. These are just eastern North Dakota, and these come from, you can see this data in the North Dakota Extension Bulletin for wheat. So this is averaged over those 4 locations. And you can see we had very high yields in those locations, as I mentioned earlier. And the top yielding line was PFC buns, and then the new 3999, and also higher yielding varieties, Trigger, Ballistic, Driver, Justify, and Spitfire. And some of the other newer ones, Reckless, had a yield above average as well. That's what the blue line indicates. And on this slide, of course, there's a lot of varieties, but there's a lot of varieties here, very close to the average yield. And on some of the newer varieties, the Torgy, and right below that was the Froberg and the Ambush. Then we had some of the other lines we're looking at, Wildcat, 3530, and then varieties that had below average at these locations. Murdoch was down a little bit most of the locations this year. I'm not quite sure why, but has done a little bit better in the past years. And the Westbred lines, 9590 and the 9479 were down in these trial averages. And the other newer one, AP Smith, fell a little bit below the average this year. Now for Langdon, we just averaged Park River, Cavalier, and Candu. I didn't throw in the sites Langdon and Pekin. I need to look at those as standalone. That's because some of the the shattering issues we had here. But at Langdon, some of the top yielding lines were typically higher yielding lines like Ballistic, Trigger, and then the newer line 3119A, the 3530, which we've tested for several years, looked very well, and Buster. And the newer one here, AP Smith, did above average in our three locations here, as well as Torgy and Gunsmoke. Ambush was right on the average of these three trials, and then we kind of dropped below average below that with some of the varieties, as you can see here. Froberg was below, and also Murdoch was lower yielding in our trials this year, as well as Barracuda. Protein wise this year, highest yielding or highest protein variety was Heartland, McLeod, Barracuda, Rebel. You see there's a lot of them are very similar to one another. Some of the newer ones would be Gunsmoke in this particular slide. And Torgy had above average yield as well. And our lower protein lines this year were our higher yielding lines, Trigger, which we typically see, Buster, and 3188 and the 3119A. Typically at the end of the week, I show a couple slides showing, the average gross revenue. We take into consideration yield and also protein premiums. So when I went into or called in for the protein premiums into a local elevator, there's, I don't pay that much close attention to that particular marketing trait, but they said there haven't been any for the last couple of months, and they don't expect any in the near future. So that's something I've never seen in all the years I've done this either. There's always been some sort of protein premium, but none this year. So obviously our high yielding variety brought you the most gross revenue this past year. The varieties have our three location means that had above yield and above protein, average protein were Wildcat, AP Smith, Torgy, Rebel, 6111, Ambush, and Cobra. So these would be one of the balanced lines. Just wanted to bring up shattering. We did have shattering at Langdon and Pekin. Some of this cause may have been due to delayed harvest, but you can also see up here, I took a picture here, you can see some of these kernels coming out of the glooms, and we also at that time still have some green in the head. So as I mentioned, in these locations we had some uneven emergence. So we had to wait until the later emerging plants were ripe enough to harvest, and about that time we had that about 10 days at the end of August where it kind of rained. Didn't rain a whole lot sometimes, but it certainly wasn't harvest weather. And then we had some very high winds at the same time, so we with some of the kernels already appearing or poking out of the glooms with the high winds, we did get some shatter. And this is a relative rating, so this is, I'd call about a 3. You know, I look down and say, well, there's none, which is 0, or there's, wow, there's a lot. But the highest ones we had this year were Froberg, Commander and Buster, Wildcat, Marek, and Ballistic, 3s and above. And that was an average of Langdon Pekin, and just at Langdon, it was Buster, Reckless, and the 84, 62 Allegiant line, and Bulls. And, you know, I haven't seen shattering for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, and then it wasn't as much as we saw this year, but yet some fields or locations didn't have any shattering, so it was kind of sporadic. Some fields had shattering. You drive down the fields, usually get some growth behind the combine, and some of these fields were, you know, solid green, so you know there was some shattering out the fields. And I talked to the wheat breeder at NDSU, Dr. Green, and a variety like Froberg. They've been watching this line for 10 years or more, you know, different locations across the state. It's been tested in regional trials. It's probably been down in New Zealand, and they've never noticed it had shattering. So some of these, and that probably goes true for most of these varieties, it's probably a one-time thing, but just, you know, I like to record it, just something to keep in mind. But um, and I think with more timely harvest, as I mentioned before, some of the events that happened this year, you won't see some of this. You did in other fields in the area as well. Best weight, not going to talk too much about it. Just kind of best weight line we had this year was McLeod, Cannon, Heartland, Ambush, and then there's several that had test weights above the mean. And some of our lower test weight lines this were the 3119, Buster 3188, Ballistic Spitfire 3530. Just going to go over this quickly, more for your information. You know, you can view this as later. But the earliest lines that we have are really Cannon and Barracuda, and then we have several others. And some of these numbers were condensed this year because of it was warmer and hotter, so it took a shorter amount of time between varieties to head with the warm temperatures. The later ones would be the newer buns, the 35 or 3119 and the 3099, honest ones and trigger. And for height, some of these were condensed because of the dry weather, didn't get very tall. When we look at a statewide basis, shorter ones were the Westbred lines, Wildcat and Smith, where the taller lines were the 3530 Fowler, Driver, Rebel, and Bowles. Straw strength, pretty bunched this year. Probably the 9479 was the strongest, and the weaker ones, Gunsmoke, Justify, 3188, Dagmar, and Rebel. And most of these this year occurred in the rating of between 3 and 4, so not a lot of difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about durum now. Not a lot of durum raised in our area. I think last year in the northeast part of the state, there's about 16,000 acres. So, but still, there's some interest in it. The varieties this year, the top one has been a shift. The newer one, ND Revelin, took up quite a bit of the acreage this year. The top was still Joppa, so those two occupy the most acres across the state of durum varieties planted. As far as 3-year average, or in 2021, we should say, you can see the average is quite a bit lower than the 3-year because of the conditions, but generally, Revelin and Granora are top ones. ND Stanley is a new variety from NDSU, and it's been very good for yield. And long-term average over 3 years, it's been one of our higher yielding varieties, ND Stanley and also Revelin. Langdon, the top yields for the past 5 years, Revelin, Carpio, Peak from Viterra, Divide, and Stanley. Agronomic traits, not a lot of difference between some of these varieties. Lodging, Peak would have the weakest straw. El Cabo would have the strongest. A little bit better for Reveland and Stanley. Days to Head, Hythe, they're all very similar to one another, as well as Scab. Most of them are 5s, some are 6s, but they still haven't really capped that Scab resistance in durum as yet. A little bit about barley. Acreage 580,000 this year. I see stocks are down, so right now there's some good prices for barley, and maybe a good opportunity next year if you wanted to raise barley for malt, or also there's some interest, some demand for barley in the pet food industry, where you don't have to be so careful with protein and other malting factors. Eastern North Dakota 3-year average and 2021. I think we just look at the 3-year average. It kind of follows what we've seen in past years. We see the AC Connect, Synergy, and Cardinal have been some of the top varieties, and along with ND Genesis. And that's pretty consistent how we've seen it the past 3 years, and also at Lang, and we see that same trend. 2021, Pinnacle, Genesis, Synergy, Connect, Brewski is NDSU released, but is released to a private company. So if you have contract with that, you could opportunity to raise that line. And on 3-year average, again, we see Connect, Synergy, Genesis are been our top yielding varieties. Straw strength. Typically, straw strength of the 2 rows has gotten better. CDC Fraser and Bow probably be our strongest straw varieties. And days to head, we see the most of the varieties for the 2-row are a little bit longer maturing than you would see for a 6-row variety. Of course, with 2-row varieties, we don't see as many issues with malting as far as getting 14% or lower protein. Genesis typically had the lowest protein of the lines. Proteins are up somewhat this year, and a lot of that, of course, you'll see when you get lower yield and you get more concentration of the protein, and you would get higher protein levels. So thank you for listening to the variety update this year. I think one thing I would recommend is typically if you check your data in the northeast part of the state, the Langdon data or Carrington, or whatever your go-to location, I'd suggest you look at other locations this year. If you're in the eastern part of the state, you could check out Minnesota, because there's a lot of differences, as you can see in the averages, and you can see how these varieties responded to each of the locations. And there's a little more variability in some of these trials. Most of them were pretty good, but there were some that had higher variability, so you need to watch that as well. So hopefully in 22, we'll have a little bit better growing conditions, and I wish every one of you the best of luck in 2022. Thank you.